Hey guys, in this video we will start wiring up our registration form with our database. The objective of this video is that when we submit our form, the data that is displayed on the success.php page will also get submitted to our attendee table in our database. Now, this process starts with modification of our code. So we go back to Visual Studio Code, and then what we want to do is create a new file in our DB folder. So I'm going to create a new file, click on the DB folder, create new file, and I'm going to call this one crud.php. Now, CRUD is an acronym for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. And the purpose of this file is to store all of the functions or all of the code associated with those operations. This will also represent our first step into using an object-oriented approach to our PHP development. So the first thing that we want to do, as usual in any PHP file, is create our PHP block. And then inside this block, we're going to define a class. And the class name, I usually make my class name reflective of the file name. So that way I know exactly what class is represented by what file. So I'm going to call this class crud. And if you're not very familiar with what I'm doing here with class and objects and so on, it's fine. You can just stick with me and I will explain it along the way. But this is the object-oriented approach to programming. Now I'm going to define a private attribute and I'm going to call this one DB. And then I'm going to define a function, but this is a special function that every class has or can have, and it's called a constructor. So I'm going to write the word function, and we would have looked at how we define functions before. And in PHP, all you have to say is the word function and then give it a name. So we say function, and then this is how we define a constructor. So it is 2 underscores and then the word construct. So that's underscore construct. And our constructor is going to take a parameter, and I'm going to call this parameter con. Right? So essentially, when you're initializing an object of a class, you can actually opt to do it without any objects, without any parameters, or if you require a parameter, this is where you would have defined that a parameter is required or some value is required anytime you're initializing an object of that class type. So I'm going to take a parameter called con, and then I'm going to assign whatever value came in to this con parameter to our private variable called db. So then I'm going to say this, which is a keyword in most programming languages, which just means in this class file that I'm in. So this is just a short way of saying I'm home. All right. So this gives me access to all the private and public attributes of this class file. So in this case, I want this db to get the value that con has. All right. So in other words, wherever I'm going to use db throughout this class, it should embody whatever value came in con. All right. So I just went ahead and added some comments so that we have a bit more context as to what is happening with each line of code. Now, the cool thing about a class is that you can put as many functions and variables all inside of that class, and wherever you need to reference it, all you need is an instance of the class, and you just make reference to the function that is there. So we are going to be using this class to house all of the functions associated with creating a record in our database, retrieving a record from our database, updating a record in our database, and deleting a record in our database. So for this video, we will focus on fleshing out the insert function. So I'm going to say function, but then I have to qualify this one as public. So I did say private here, and I also have the option of public. So what this means is that if I declare an object of class crud, there is no way for me to interact with db because db is private to the class. So the only way I can interact with db is from another function inside of the class. However, when I do say public, then it allows me to interact with it outside of this. So I'm going to say public function, and I'm going to simply call this insert, and I'll just create that function body. And then insert now is supposed to get some parameters so that it knows what it should be inserting. So I'm going to define parameters here inside this insert function that will be able to accept all of the values that are being passed in the post action. So let me say that a different way. Remember, from our form, we're collecting a bunch of data points: name, first name, last name, date of birth, etc. So all of these data points are going to get submitted. When they get submitted, they go into the success.php page, which is our action, and we can access them all using the post variable. What we can't do, however, is actually put them in the database, at least not yet. So I'm going to define a function inside of my crud file that is going to be waiting and willing to accept values that would be coming from the post function or the post array. So in other words, I'm going to create a parameter per data point. So I'm going to have one for first name, and I'm going to kind of write it shorthand so they don't have to necessarily reflect the exact name. So I'm going to shorten it, but at least I'll know what F name means and L name. And I'm just declaring some variables that will actually house all of the values coming back. And specialty. Okay. So once again, when I call this function to insert, the expectation is that I'm going to be passing a value per parameter, and then the operation that I carry out inside of the function will use those values to complete the insert. Now on to the fun part. Inside of my function, I'm going to start off with a try and catch. So I can actually just write the word try and then press tab twice, and then Visual Studio Code just completes the entire try catch for me. So let me do that again. I just wrote the word try, pressed tab twice. If you have both, you can make sure the second one is the one that is in focus, and press tab twice, and then you will get your try catch block automatically. If that doesn't work for you, then just type this out: try, open brace, close brace, catch, open parentheses, and open and close braces. Now, once again, the try catch block says that I'm going to try and do something here, but I'm watching to see if I get an error so that I can take a particular action with this error. And this is what you call exception handling. All right. So, and I just added a comment here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called SQL. And this variable is just going to play host to my SQL insert statement. But I'm going to give you guys a little trick. If you're not so comfortable with SQL statements, then you can actually go over to your database in PHP MyAdmin, click on your table, and then go to SQL, and then click insert, and it kind of gives you a little template as to what an insert statement needs to look like. So following this guide, we know how we need to type out our statements and how we are going to put them into PHP. But once again, if it is that you want to develop your SQL and database development skills, then you need to check out my course, which is MySQL Database Development and Mastery. So back in our code, we're actually just going to type this all together. So I'm going to say insert into. So those are SQL keywords. And then I'm going to specify the table name, which in this case is attendee, because I'm about to insert a record into the attendee table. And I have to specify which columns. Now, there are two schools of thought or two ways to do this. You can specify all the columns. You don't necessarily have to, because if you put the column values, if you put the values in the exact order that they would have appeared, if you said value, then you don't necessarily have to do this part of it. So I'm going to skip that part of it, and I'm just going to write it the faster way. So the first column would be first name, last name, date of birth, email address, contact number, And well, remember we had specialty ID and not just a specialty. So we'll get to that. But that's the order. We don't need to put in anything for attendee ID because it's an auto-incrementing primary key. So after the would-be list of columns comes the word values. So we would have had attendee and then listing out all the columns, and then we say values. But since we're not listing the columns, I'll just remove that. So if you're listing the columns, you have the parentheses. If you're not, then you don't need them. All right. And then we'll say values. But here is the crazy part. So with a regular SQL statement, you would have stipulated a value that corresponds with each one of these. So if I just fill this out right now, I would have put something like the static value, Mary, and Poppins, etc. Right? I'm not going to fill out all of this, but that's what I would have done. Let me just zoom in so everybody can see. All right. So that is what I would have been putting in if I was writing this statement manually. And if you were using the MySQL or the MySQL data API, then that's also how you would have written it. However, the dangers of doing it directly like that in PHP, it opens you up to what you call SQL injections, which are a very, very nasty kind of attack that you really don't want to entertain. Okay, so as a guard against that, PDO requires that we write it in a particular way, and then it will execute it. So the particular way that we're going to write it will have us actually using like placeholders. So instead of saying the value, I'm just going to put colon and a placeholder to correspond with what should be there. All right, so I'm going to say colon F name, colon L name, and I'm just going to reuse all of those variable names from the parameters. So really and truly, once again, these are placeholders. They don't have any values right now. So at the end of this exercise, you should have these placeholders once again. And I gave them similar names to each variable that I know they will correspond with. You didn't have to, but for consistency, I recommend that you do. All right. So we would have created some very, very abstract form of an SQL statement. The next step is to prepare this SQL statement. So I'm going to declare another variable, and I'm going to call this one STMT. That's short for statement. So that's just my naming convention. All right. And then I'm going to say this. And then this is how we actually access our private variable DB. So remember that DB represents the PDO connection, or the connection. And we would have already defined our connection from inside of con. And this is our PDO object, which represents connecting to the database. So here within the class crud, this is an abstraction of this connection. So PDO exists here, but what we intend to do is pass it into the crud class, and it will get stored as DB. So the only way to access DB is to say this. So that's $this, and then we use that operator. So that's a dash and a greater than sign or less than sign, well, an arrow. And this arrow is basically how we reference attributes or properties or functions within from a class, all right, or from an object. So this represents the object of class crud, and then we are accessing the property or attribute DB. So we say DB, and then inside of DB we have another function. So I'm going to use that arrow again, and this function is called prepare. And then prepare takes a parameter, which would be the SQL statement. So we could have just done this. We could have said this arrow DB arrow prepare, and then just write that SQL statement inside of the parentheses. But I like segmenting it like this so that each step of the way it is clear what is happening. So we kind of defined our SQL statement first, and then we went ahead and prepared it for execution later. The next step is to actually bind our placeholders to the actual values. So remember that these with the colons here inside of our SQL statement are really placeholders, but the real values are expected to come in through these parameters. So we need to have a section where we say stmt and then arrow, and then we call a function called bind param. And then this function takes two parameters. It takes parameter number 1, which is our placeholder. So fname is the first placeholder, and then we have a comma, and then we say what do you want to bind this placeholder to. And essentially what this will do is say that within this statement that is being prepared, I want that these placeholders get replaced with these values. Now, it may seem tedious, it may seem mundane, especially if you're used to just writing your SQL statement and you insert into. But once again, this is an added level of protection against the SQL injection attack. So you are going to do that for each placeholder, and I'm just going to duplicate these lines, and I'm just going to change what I need to change. All right, so you can just copy and paste and kind of expedite that process. And here's one of the advantages with using the placeholder, making the placeholder look just like the variable name. The changes can occur more quickly. So I'm just going to go ahead and change those out. All right, so I'm finished binding all of my placeholders and everything looks good to go. And the final thing to do, oh, sorry, I made a mistake with my object name. I had the code written somewhere else and I copied and pasted. So I've gotten that corrected. All right, so now that we've bound all of the placeholders with our actual values, the next thing that we want to do is actually execute. So we say stmt and then I use my arrow and I'm going to call a function called execute. And this one takes no parameters. And then after we write execute, I'm going to write return true. So at least if it gets this far and it returns true, then we can take this as a success indicator that our statement was executed successfully. Now, on the negative side of the fence, we want to actually handle any error that might come up. And at this stage, we really want to see any error that comes up. So I'm going to replace this throwable th with PDO exception. So remember that we're carrying out a PDO operation here. So the most likely exception to occur is with the PDO operation. And I'm going to assign any error object that comes back to a variable called E. And then what I'm going to do down here is echo to the screen. So I'm not going to throw, because throwing would stop the execution altogether, but I'm going to echo E arrow get message. So we would have used E arrow get message before, and I'm sure you were wondering what that arrow meant. So I hope that this exercise has brought more context to what this arrow is, because E is really just an object of a whole class. And we just established that within a class, the only way to access what is in the class is to use the arrow operator, and then we can actually interact with the other functions. So STMT here is an object of DB prepare, and then the STMT object has a function bind param and a function execute. So in the same way, $E represents the class or an object of the class PDO exception, and one of the functions available to us is get message. And then if an error is caught and not thrown, but printed to the screen, then we want to return false. So then this is just an indicator to say, hey, it was not successful. Now that we have made those changes to our CRUD page or CRUD file, now we have a few changes that we want to make to our connection file. The first thing I want to do is add what we call attributes to the PDO object. So right now it's connecting to the database and it's all fine and dandy. But when we were doing this exercise, we did not set attributes, and those attributes that I really want are like error mode. So in other words, PDO will always try to behave itself and be unintrusive, but then you can force it to behave a certain way by setting the attributes. And the certain way I want it to behave is that if there's an exception, I actually want it to stop all execution and show me that there's an exception. So what I'm going to do here is reference the PDO object, and I'm going to call the function inside this object called set attribute. And then I'm just going to type these out quickly off screen, and then we'll just review them. So these are the two attributes that I want to set, and they're both as it relates to error. So I'm setting this attribute, and the error mode is exception. All right. So essentially, this attribute is just saying that whenever there's an error, I want to see that there's an error. Don't behave yourself. Tell me that there's an error, because the last thing you want is during debugging, you think it's all well and fine, and then you push the production and then nothing works. So we want to see when there's an error. So that's what this line is saying. That's change number one. The next change that we want to make is to actually reference our CRUD file from right here in con. And I'm going to explain why we're going to do it this way. Remember that in our pages, we are referencing our con.php. Instead of having to reference con.php and then reference CRUD, what I'm going to do is, after setting up a successful connection, of course, because the only way we'll get this far is if no exception is thrown, I want to include, or well, I can require, and I'm only going to require it once, and I want crud.php. Notice I don't have to put db/crud, because this is the con file that is requiring the file. So if I look at the folder level, they're both on the same level in the db folder, so I don't have to say db/crud. So if you wrote db/crud and it didn't work, then try and remove the db/ and it should work. So I'm referencing crud.php, and then I'm going to define a whole new object, and I'm calling it crud. And to define an object, I'm going to say this is the name of the object, and I want it to be equal to a new instance of my class. And remember that the class, the file name is crud.php, the class name is crud.php, and the object name is crud.php. Well, it's crud. So everything is crud, so everything looks uniform. So the new instance of crud, and then crud requires, and here Visual Studio Code is telling me that there is something that needs to go inside of the parameters, and that's because when we defined our constructor, we defined it to accept some value. All right. So the value that it's expecting in this situation, in our context, because we're the ones building it, we know that the value it's expecting is some connector. So I'm going to pass the PDO object into my parameter. So PDO. So now what will happen is that for each time that we actually include or require the con file, the connection will be established, and this will be done once. And then it will just reference our CRUD file, so that any operation we want to carry out, we need only reference the CRUD object and whatever function. So at this point, we only have one function. So anywhere we actually have con referenced on any page, we can actually just go ahead and reference $CRUD. And then using our arrow operator, we can look at all the other functions in there. So armed with this new knowledge, what we need to do is actually start setting up our success page to be able to call our CRUD function. So step number one is require, and I'm just going to require once, and we're going to put on the db/con.php. So when this page loads, it's going to require this file, which is going to go ahead and initiate a connection. And then it's now going to require our CRUD file and define a new class. And then anything we need to do on the page, we can just say object CRUD and call the function. So this way we're segmenting the code and we're keeping everything one place. We're not putting too much PHP or too much database too many database operations mixing up with our HTML all the time, and it's a nice, cleaner way to have your code. Now that I've completed that activity, I'm going to start writing some more PHP code, and I'm just going to use the block that's there already. So what I want to do is check if this page is being loaded on a post action, and I'll contextualize that. Remember that we can always go to our application and just say localhost/attendance/success.php. All right. And because it's a post, we don't have any of those parameters. We don't have that query string. But then when I do that, I'm going to be getting a bunch of errors about undefined variables. And that is really because it is trying to print values from the post action. If there was no post action, meaning I'm just browsing to the page casually, I didn't actually submit a form to get there, then these variables don't exist. So before we attempt to put anything in the database, we probably want to check if such a variable exists. And if at least one out of all of these exists, then we can assume that the rest of them exist. All right. Now, when we were designing our form, I had put a name on the submit button, and this is why. So a lot of the times you'll see that people put a name on the submit button, and what they'll do is check if the submit variable exists, because this would have come over in the post variable along with first name, last name, etc., etc. Even though it has no value, it exists. So it's like an empty variable on the post action. So what we want to do is start off by checking if that submit value exists. So I can say if, and I'll say is set. So that's the function to say, does it exist? And inside is set, we pass in a variable. So this is a nice way to check if a variable exists on a page. So I'm going to check if is set, square bracket, and submit. So once again, this is not checking for a value, it's just checking, does this variable exist? Whether it's empty or not is irrelevant. Does it exist on the page? And if it does, then we want to carry out an action. The red line was there because I missed this semicolon. Sorry about that. All right, so we say if is set post submit. So if the post submit variable exists, then we want to proceed with our operation. So I'm going to define another variable, and I'm going to call it success equals. And the reason I'm doing this is I'm about to call the crud function insert. And remember that insert is a value returning function because it's either returning true or false. So that means, well, I probably can call this is success instead of success. So this is asking a question, is it successful, true or false? Is it a success? All right. And then I'm going to assign to this variable whatever is returned from the function. Now, because we defined or we required db /con.php, and remember that it initializes some object for us called crud, I have instant access to this object called crud. And then inside of the crud object, I want my insert function. And this insert function is defined to accept in this order these values: the first name, the last name, date of birth, email address, contact, and specialty. So I'm actually going to go ahead and fill in these values using the post values. So one pattern could be that you just pass the post value directly into the function. I'm not particularly fond of that. I prefer to define my variables. So I'm going to have fname. So within the context of success.php, fname didn't exist. So I can reuse it here. So fname is equal to post first name. And I'm going to do that for each of the values in the post. And I'm going to do that off screen, so you can go ahead and do that. All right, so I've added all of these values from the post array and some comments so that we know exactly what's happening at each step. And then what I'm going to do is call the insert function and pass in the required parameters. So it's fname, lname, dob, email in that exact order. So I'm going to say $fname as the first parameter, $lname, and I'm just going to do all of them. Just make sure that they all line up. All right, so once that is done, let me just recap what will happen. So when this page is loaded, it will check if one of the post variables exists. And we're working with the assumption that if one exists, then the others exist. So if one exists, then we want to extract all the values from each one. And this is done because maybe you get in the value, but you want to manipulate it before you put it into the database. So that's why this is always a good idea before actually calling the insert function. And then at the end of that, we check if it was a success. Well, we pass those values into our insert function, and then the result of the insert function will get stored in this variable is success. So then this comes in handy because if we want to print a specific message, if it was successful versus if it was a failure, then this gives us that ability. So I can say if is success, meaning if this was true, then do something else, do something else. All right. So right now what we're doing is printing a nice alert or a nice success message when you have been successfully registered. Up until now, there wasn't any real operation to make it a failure. So what I'm going to do is take this h1 tag and actually echo this h1 tag if it was a success. So if is success, then we will see that success message being printed to the screen. Else, we're going to echo the opposite. I'm going to reuse that code, but I'm going to change this to text danger, which will give us red text. And then we will say there was an error in processing. There was an error. All right, so once again, we're checking to see if we got true or false returned from this insert function. And if it is true, then we want to give them a success message. And if it was false, then we want to show them that, hey, there was an error processing your registration. Now we have one additional and very major change to make, and that is as it relates to our specialty. Now, up until this point, specialty has been coming across as text. We have a select control here, a drop-down list giving us each specialty, and when we submitted it on the success page, when we printed the value, we got a text. We got some body of text. Now the problem with that is we designed our database to accept a specialty ID. So we have a specialties table which is empty right now, so we can always fill this with data, but the attendee table is taking the ID relative to the specialties in this table. So firstly, I need to insert at least, well, I'm going to insert one for this video. So I'm going to insert the database admin specialty. So I click on my table, specialties, and then I click on insert. And then I'm going to not give it an ID value because I can't, but I'm going to give it the name database admin and then click go. This will show me that it's about to execute an insert command, and on the bottom of the page I can click go again, and then that inserts it. So when I look in that database by just clicking on the table, it will always show me what's there, and I see that, well, it did a double entry. Okay, I can remove one, that's fine. But now I see that I have at least one record here, and I have database admin, and the ID here is 3, which means because we set up that constraint on the table, I can't put in an ID value here that doesn't exist in the table. So whatever I'm about to insert into my database needs to match with those constraints. So I'm going to force this. So we're going to make this more dynamic as we go along, but for now, I'm just going to force the value associated with this option to be 3. So we'll just make sure that Mary Poppins, for example's sake, selects 3 and she's a database admin. And when we submit, what the expectation is that 3 will be printed here, and 3 will be passed over in the post, and then 3 will be the value that is received here in specialty and ultimately put into the database. All right, so I'm going to try and submit the form, and let's see if we get any errors and try and weather through them. So when I submit, I'm seeing that I'm getting a few errors here. And the first one is saying that there's an undefined index date of birth, and they give me the line number in the file. And when I look back, they are right because it's not date of birth, it's actually DOB. So that's my mistake. So I'll just make that correction. The next error is saying that I have an undefined method called get massage. So that's a spelling error on my part. So on crud.php on line 30, we can go ahead and make that correction. So that's get message. And then we can try and resubmit. And I expect to see errors again because, all right, there we go. There was an error in processing. So what this did was it attempted the operation as specified, and it returned false. And then because it returned false, we're printing out that red text saying there was an error processing. There was an error in processing. But then we're also echoing the message because we did say get message it should be echoed. And what we're echoing is saying that the insert value list does not match something, something, something. And that's because the word database admin is still coming across instead of the ID. All right, so let's try that again. And the error was because I did not refresh my page. I just resubmitted the form. So let's try and fill out the form once again. And then we can proceed to submit. All right, so I'm still getting the error. And if we read the error, it's saying that the value list does not match the column list. So that is because, well, it's saying that there's some column mismatching with the values that we provided. So what I'm going to do is just modify my insert into and be very, very explicit. And I'm going to say column first name, last name, date of birth. So these are the column names as they appear in the database design. So you can always just remind yourself as to what the columns are by clicking on the table itself and then going to structure. And you see first name, last name, date of birth, email address, contact number. So you have to be very, very, very sure that you're spelling them right. So that's date of birth, email address, contact number, and specialty _ ID. So we can try this one more time. So I'm going to go back to my form. I'm going to refresh once again, fill it out, and submit, and I have success. All right. And then you notice that there's a 3 coming back here in this printout as opposed to the word database admin. So that's fine. As we go along, we'll refine it. But the important thing is that after all of these changes and activities, we have finally registered somebody successfully. Now, to validate that the person has been registered successfully, we can always go back to PHP My Admin, click on our attendee table, and we will see our record there. Mary Poppins, and you'll see that the date of birth came across as zeros, and that's because of a formatting issue, but we will sort that out. But right now we have victory because we have successfully submitted our first record to the database. Congrats.